Ladies and gentlemen, a warm online welcome to the Mobility Talks, the web series by the EIT Urban Mobility, where all aspects of urban mobility are considered and discussed in depth. In our previous episode, we took to the skies with urban air mobility as our key topic. But today, we're back on our feet to explore the concept of the public realm and how it is transforming our streets and urban spaces. I must admit that when I started preparing this talk, I was a bit puzzled by the concept of the public realm, as I see both words as contradictory. The realm is inherently the property of a monarch, so you can't really get further away from the concept of public property. But I understand that behind this concept is the question of sovereignty, and considering a city as public realm is not just thinking about urban mobility or urban design or urban planning, but it forces us to think about the underlying factors that determine the use of space in a city and whether or not citizens are able to shape the way their cities are conceived. Within the public realm, urban mobility is, of course, a key factor affecting the way cities are developed. On the one hand, urban mobility solutions become an intrinsic part of the public realm and form part of a city's cultural heritage. For instance, can we imagine London without the big red bus, Lisbon without a tram, Paris without the metro, or Rome without the Vespa? But on the other hand, has the development of motorized traffic, private vehicles, and the roads or parking spaces designed to accommodate for them come at the expense of the public realm, the livability of public urban spaces, or even the fundamental raison d'être of a city? Quoting the architect Greg Lynn, it's most satisfying to have an effect on the public realm. Deep down, I think it's what every architect wants to do. So today, I suggest we all become little architects and dare to challenge the city as we see it today. To do so, I am joined by an inspiring lineup of speakers. But before I introduce them, let me just remind you that if you exit the full screen, you can view the Slido box to the right of the live streaming window. And that's where you can raise your questions and comments. And I strongly encourage you to do so. As for online events, it's really the only way to feel the buzz in the room. So I will also launch right now a first poll for you, where we want to see what does the public realm inspire for you, and you can choose your top 3 from a whole list of options, from leisure, transformation, social interaction, freedom, green areas, sports, etc., etc. So pick your top 3 and we'll be commenting on that as we go along. So without further ado, let's see what our keynote speaker has to say on the matter. And I'm really delighted to introduce Andreas Röhl. I've been practicing that for a while. Andreas is associate at GEL, and he will help us all become little budding architects, trying to reshape, rethink, and redesign our cities and the role of urban mobility in the public realm. So Andreas is joining us from Copenhagen in Denmark, and thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. And the floor is yours, Andreas.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Speaking about architects, this gentleman to the left has worked all over the world as an architect. This is GEL Architects founder, Professor Jan GEL, and I am working at the company he started, GEL Architects, and I'm going to draw on Jan's experience, but also very much the experience of where I worked before I joined GEL Architects. But before I start going through my slides, a quick word also on the person next to Jan, which is Jan GEL's wife. And the thing is, Jan GEL, he studied an architect in the 60s. And then his wife, who is a psychologist, asked him, so how come your architects are not interested in people, but only in buildings? And that hit Jan both in the heart, but also in the brain. And since then, actually, Jan Gehl has specialized and focused on what happens actually between the buildings in our cities, in the public space, in the public realm, and what kind of public space do we people enjoy being in. So this will very much also inspire what I'll be speaking about. Sorry, just a moment. I lost a link here. Jan Gehl really believes in that how we design our cities really inspire how we behave in the cities. This is just one example. This is another one, and it just shows, as was said in the introduction, kind of the power of the engineers or the whoever is involved in designing our cities. You could argue that a traditional planning process looks like this. We start doing some buildings, then we focus on the traffic, the topic of today, the mobility, and then what happens between the buildings, what kind of life that is there, is kind of a little bit left to chance. Where we at Gehl Architects really try to change this process, turn it around. So we start with discussing what kind of life do we want in our cities. Then we discuss what kind of physical space can support the life we want, and then how can we design buildings around the space that can support the life we would like. So we try to turn the planning process around. Speaking about mobility, you could say again, the starting point should be the people in our cities, and then, okay, what kind of movement can support the life we want in our cities, and then what kind of infrastructure can support the movement and the life we would like. I'll speak a little bit about Jan Gehl's original thinking and how today we're speaking about the 15-minute city and so on, very much, again, linking public space, public realm, and mobility. I'll speak briefly about the perception of travel time, and then maybe spend a minute or two on what are we currently working on with the EIT and where is the link to what I'm speaking about today. First about the public space, and this about a short trip culture. We know that really the length of our trips is very much deciding what mode of transport we use. This is a figure from Copenhagen showing the modal split of different modes depending on distance to work. The blue is walking, the red is cycling. And you can see, which is no surprise, but still it's good to have this fact, how the market share for cycling and walking obviously very much drops as soon as we are doing longer trips. So again, the more we can design our cities for short trips, the better, for sure. And that's why sometimes I say that playgrounds should be a tool for the traffic planner or for the traffic engineer. Because really the power of, you could say, local destinations in our public realm is really not just a matter for people interested in playgrounds, but also should be a matter for people working with mobility. Because if we can go somewhere close to where we live, the chance of we choosing walking, cycling, is much bigger than if we have to go some distance to get to where we want. Another very concrete example from Denmark is how more and more cities are doing what we call harbor baths in very central areas of the city. In the old days, people needed to get into the car, maybe a bus, but a lot of people into the car, go out on the highway in the rush hour and drive out to the beach if they wanted to go to the beach. Now suddenly you can walk or you can cycle down into the center of your city and get a swim. And the mobility impact of such a thing is for sure huge. But until recently, I think these things were very much seen as, oh, this is a thing about public space. It's not really related to mobility, but there's very much this link. And again, this is also linking to the thinking about 15-minute city and so on. But really, we need to understand how these public spaces, semi-public spaces in our cities matters a lot, not just for our daily well-being, but also for the mobility patterns being developed. This is a picture from an inner courtyard in Copenhagen, where we have a lot of these shared green inner courtyards. Again, that means people living in dense areas, they have access to a park park-ish environment or a garden-ish environment very, very close by, which again makes it attractive and not so important to get in a car or travel longer, because you can walk just out of your door and be in a quite nice green environment. And we are currently in new developments, copying this concept of having this inner courtyard that is not just for parking cars and for garbage, but is actually a common space that is very, very easy to access. Another tendency where we have this thing of integrating functions and this link to mobility currently in Copenhagen is how we open up schoolyards. We design them of a much better quality, and we can do that because now they're open in the evening, in the weekends, and they work as a community hub. So it's not just a thing for the school kids during school time. It has a broader perspective, and again helps create these attractive local destinations, a higher quality public realm. At Gale, we did a lot of research what happened during Corona, and I'm sure most of you know, but what we can see was just that the time spent in local public destinations and the value people put on local public destinations just increased during Corona. So I think this period we've been through have just even more emphasized the value and the importance of having easy access to attractive destinations close to where we live. And again, that really makes this link between mobility and public realm very, very clear. This is just other numbers from this research. What have been building on, I think, a lot of Jan Gehl's thinking is this book by Peter Jones speaking, and others speaking about link and place. And again, highlighting that when we speak about public realm, we're not just speaking about parks and squares, but we're also very much speaking about the streets in our cities, and that they have more than one function. They are also for staying, for meeting people. They are not just for moving things. And this is another angle just to highlight today, how we see that in more and more cities, this understanding of streets is being worked into how they design, how they think about the city. This is an example for a report we did for the state of Victoria in Australia, doing a street design guideline very much based on the thinking of link and place, and how can we define streets within this concept, so we don't remember the importance of having also a quality public realm and not just focus on traffic, which is often by many people seen as about cars and public transport and not walking and cycling. We also see in more and more cities now streets actually being designed, and not just as these streets, but as public space. One example there to the left from how a street in Copenhagen looked some years ago, and then to the right how it looks today, with much more public space next to the link function of the street. To the right, there's a street from Copenhagen recently redesigned also. Not anymore any through-going car traffic, cycle tracks added, just one car lane, and then a linear park in the middle that really works well as a public space, and again give people in this area easy access to attractive public space. And as a contrast to the left, what is essentially is a very similar street in Düsseldorf, but that has not yet kind of been through this perspective of also being a public space. This is still a street very, very much focused on moving traffic, and on this, in this instance, this traffic being car traffic. But again, we see more and more examples of these streets, people realizing they have more than one function. It's not just a link, it's very much a public space. Some things do not change when we speak about mobility in cities and how to make it attractive to get to all these local destinations. Or when we have discussions, can we change the function of some of these streets? And that is, when you do these kind of things, you cannot make everybody happy. And this is just an example from Copenhagen, how a street looked before and how it looks today. And in all cities, there's a lot of tough decisions, tough political prioritizations to do these things. But I think more and more cities have examples that this actually works. In Copenhagen and at Gale, we work a lot with data and really using real life examples as a building block to when we do the next of these kind of improvements. And this is one of the very first examples from Copenhagen, where we saw streets also very much as a public space. This is our walking street called Strøget. And what is interesting is the argument against doing a walking street in the center of Copenhagen in 1962 are very, very similar to arguments brought up today when you want to change public space and maybe make more space for people walking, cycling, or for staying activity. The shops will die, the climate in Denmark is wrong, it's not the Danish culture to be outside in the winter and whatever. Very similar arguments to what you hear today. But we were lucky. Actually, the streets on this the shops on this walking street have a great time. And we even see people coming when it's raining, even in Denmark. So we can change and we can learn to enjoy public space in large volumes if it's there. Just other examples from these tough discussions, but also so important to have these examples in each city to work on when we want to do these kind of changes. Then I think I'll spend 2 minutes, maybe 4, on the perception of travel time. And then Jean-Paul, maybe the 1 minute on the link to the EAT we do currently, and then I'm done. Because speaking about public realm and mobility, it's not just about having these nice places to get to and thereby changing the pattern of mobility towards more short trips. There's actually also a way of making our cities feel smaller. This gentleman, Hagerstrand, I haven't thought about him for a long time, but I used him when I did my master thesis years ago. And he worked with this concept of space and time. And he said how everybody kind of lives on an island. If I don't have access to a car, maybe I live on a small island. If I have access to a car, I maybe live on a big island. But the thing is, if we think like Hagerstrand and this concept of what is a human being, we can make our perception of travel time, we can make the travel time feel shorter if we design public realm cities that are attractive to move in. And that is very much about giving our eyes something to look at. This is Hildenhütter from Austria, working in Norway, that have done a lot of research into how can you actually reduce the feeling of travel time when you walk by having a good urban environment. It can feel maybe up to 30% longer if it's a boring environment you walk through. Whereas if you make it interesting with human scale at the facade, at the bottom level, greenery, whatever, you can actually make the trip feel faster. So again, here's a very strong link between how we design our public realm and mobility. And just some pictures. Jan Gehl is always speaking about active kanter in Danish, active edges. And it took me a while to find out what is the guy speaking about. And but it's really about, it's not so important what happens from the third floor and up when we are in cities, but what happens at the ground floor is so important for how we experience the city and also for our perception of travel time when we walk through cities. So this is really an important extra layer when we speak about traffic modeling, the size of cities, what kind of distance is attractive when we walk and cycle, and so on and so on. I think I'll skip this. Then last is currently we have the pleasure of being involved in an EIT project, and we are working with the University College London and a lot of other cities. And one of the efforts here is to think about how can we not solve it, but how can we add an extra layer of knowledge? So for example, we can make our traffic modeling tools better and better at also using these softer qualities that matter for how we move in cities. So that is one of the focus areas. Also develop cost-benefit analysis tool for walking to a higher quality. And one of the things we really are focusing on is, so what is it actually that make our choice of route when we cycle and walk through the city? It's not just about the traditional parameters when we speak about traffic. Very often it's very much related to travel time, traffic safety, what we put into our modeling. But the thing is, we hope to learn much more about what do these much softer things means for our route choice when we move through a city. Something to look at on the way, the chance of meeting a friend, and so on. Things not so easily to be quantified, but we know already that these matters for people when they choose their route. But we are trying in this project to see, can we be better at quantify the effect of these softer qualities that is very related to the quality of the public realm, and use that also whether we are speaking traffic modeling or we are speaking about cost-benefit analysis tool and so on. So that is, yeah, I'm looking forward to that part and continue working on this specific project. This is just an example. We are trying to use specific corridors and ask people very specific questions about what make you choose this travel route and not this. And one of the cities we're working with is Istanbul. So that was it, Jean-Paul. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Andreas, for taking us on this journey through the public realm. What we have from the audience as the top 3 or 4 concepts that they link to the public realm is social interaction, by far the number 1. Green areas, number 2, quite strong as well, and then on par, experimentation and walking. So I think that's interesting that it comes out also this need for social interaction and not just go through cities. However, you mentioned this idea of short trip culture and how that affects the mobility choice and the 15-minute city. But aren't cities inherently built around their city center and then grew out of that gradually into much larger cities? So doesn't it need to actually completely change the way cities are seen with multiple centers rather than one center? And isn't that too much of a challenge really for cities to evolve towards rather neighborhoods than cities?
I think you would never reach, the perfect 15-minute city. So I think it's more a question of having this focus on how much our land use planning affects mobility behavior, and again, how much the quality of the local destinations affect our mobility behavior. Because if we don't have that perspective, then there is the risk that, for example, again, when we discuss, should we do a new playground? Should we keep the local school? Should we do a land use planning that allows to centralize a lot of the shopping without having it locally? That we look too simply at the effects and we forget how this also very, very much impacts mobility. In a way, it sounds straightforward, but I think in many of these discussions, these things have not been connected when they have been discussed.
Okay. Thank you, Andreas. I think there's a lot of work to be done in reshaping these cities. So good luck in helping cities do that. And thanks very much for having taken the time to be with us, Andreas.
Thank you.
So to go ever deeper into this topic of the public realm, I have now the pleasure to introduce our 4 panelists who are joining us. Luca Bertolini, he is Professor of Urban Planning at the University of Amsterdam, joining us from the Netherlands. We have Rawad Shubasi, he is Planning Director and Partner at Systematica. Rawad is joining us from Milan in Italy. We have Rossella Ferrorelli, she is Urban Designer at the Comune di Milano, joining us also from Milan. And finally, we have Michael Salka, who's the Valdaura Labs Technical Coordinator at the Institute for Advanced Architecture of Catalonia, but he is joining us from Colorado in the United States of America. So good morning to you, Michael, and thanks for joining. Thanks to the 4 of you. I asked each panelist in preparation of this talk to think about an image that for them captures what the public realm means for them. So I propose that we shoot through these images, and I would ask each of you then to comment as to why you chose that image. So if we're ready, we'll launch image number 1. Rawad, over to you.
That's me. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Jean-Paul. Well, the reason why I showed this, because I think that public realm is a very valuable asset today. And unfortunately, is not distributed equally in every part. The city we're looking is exactly where Rossella and I are sitting right now, which is Milan. And we noticed that just by mapping all the public spaces and looking at how the public space is distributed. So this is not just parks. This is parks, gardens, squares, piazzas, everything that is a public space. And this is also, we're looking at the distribution of people living there. And we're trying to understand that in some areas, in the red areas, we have almost more than 500,000 of people that are living in areas that we consider less served than others in terms of square meters of public space. And this opens up a big question about the 15-minute city, for sure, but also about how we think of public space, not just as a residual space, but it is an asset that we have to protect, and we have to make sure that we are giving it back to people in the right proportions.
Okay, you're almost bringing in a social justice concept there, and at the same time, the data visualization that can help better apprehend this topic. So, okay, thanks for that. I'm sure you'll be bringing some of those elements into our discussion. Okay, let's then move to the image number 2. Image number 2. Whose is that?
This is mine. Michael Salka speaking. Thanks for the introduction, Jean-Paul, and it's great to be here with everybody. Good to meet you, or Marcelo's case, good to see you again. I chose this image, which is the Superia of the Sant Anartí neighborhood in Barcelona, a renovation done by a group called Leca Studio, completed in 2019, for a few reasons. First off, I think it just does a great job of showing what the aspiration of a public realm should be in terms of mixed modality and a diversity of uses. You can see here they've done a great job of creating a lot of different niches for seating that accommodate individuals or small groups. And by kind of eliminating traffic lanes, and especially by removing cars, created the capacity for bikes, e-scooters, pedestrians, shoppers, people just enjoying leisure time as well. And in particular, they've done this by reclaiming space that was previously only dedicated to vehicular use, motor vehicles, cars and buses, which really is, I think, the biggest opportunity we have for the public realm currently to start to reclaim some vehicular space for more complex and more humane uses. And then finally, I think this is just a great example because we have this kind of missing middle in terms of urban solutions, which is fairly typical for design in general. At the very kind of informal or low end of urbanization, we have this great discipline of tactical urbanism involving chalk painting on the sidewalks, these really kind of bottom-up spontaneous initiatives to take back space and repurpose space. Of course, these only last for maybe hours to weeks and have all kinds of problems of sustainability, of conflict with other uses, the general problems that come with informal approaches. On the other end of the spectrum, we have full urban renovation where we're replacing hard surfaces, installing formal urban furniture, perhaps redesigning buildings. Of course, this can create incredible quality that can last decades, if not longer. But it takes a long time to implement, has to go through many review processes, and is expensive. The tactical urbanism, we're talking maybe 20 to 40 meters squared, 20 to 40 euros per meter squared in Barcelona's history. The full urban renovation, maybe a few hundred euros per meter squared. But there's this missing middle of these quickly implementable but effective solutions. And we're seeing the need for those in the face of these shifting contexts like climate change or like COVID-19, where we need quick solutions that are still high quality. And here, Leca Studio has done a great job of making some simple implementations, some markings on the pavement, some furniture from sustainable materials like timber, the installation of some plantings that really give a sense of space, but with a very moderate budget and quick implementation. And I think that kind of flexibility is something that we need to prioritize.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, an image that represents something simple to achieve and yet high impact for the people living in the city, and also responds very much to this social interaction element that seems to be the thing most associated with the public realm, at least in today's audience. Okay, thanks, Michael. Let's have a look then at the third image.
Yes, this is my image. What you see here is the same street, residential street in Amsterdam. On the left, you see the street in its normal arrangement. And on the right, you see it in a temporary experimental arrangement. The arrangement on the left prioritizes motorized traffic. The arrangement on the right, no motorized traffic and public space use. And for me, this is an image, is a reminder that we can and arguably should question what we consider normal of street arrangements, because at second thought, it might turn out not that we should not consider it that normal. Why do we? It's also a reminder that if we want to question what is normal, we need to experiment, because there is a lot we do not know. Changing the arrangement of a street in the direction that this image suggests is not just changing the streets. It requires changing the way we organize our lives, the way we organize our businesses. I mean, there's a lot we need to learn there if you want to have this change. And maybe finally, let me signal a little irony that this image shows, because probably some of you have noted already, but the car on the foreground on the left is an electric car. And this is a reminder that an electric car in terms of use of space is no different than a normal car. Probably self-driving cars will also fall in that category. So it is also a reminder that what cities might need is not just different cars, but probably also just less cars.
Okay, and you bring in this concept of the experimentation. So maybe also this need to play with space and not to just see it as a fixed element. So that might scare some local policymakers, possibly. But okay, I hope that you'll be bringing some of that into our discussion as well. And so then we move to our fourth image.
Sorry, I chose this because this always makes me smile. It's not my picture, unfortunately. I didn't shot it. It's by Alberto Iacoboni, and I love it. I think it's definitely not Milan, unfortunately. I think it's from somewhere from southern Italy. But what we can learn from this image is that simply people find their way together and be convivial and happy and share in literally every kind of space, basically. So this should make us think that all space is public in a sense. And each time someone just sits together and somewhere, then a city appears. And we can learn from this, I think, how important the free use of space is, and how free this should stay in the way we govern the city. And so just to understand the risk of over-designing, over-controlling, and over-governing the city, over-defining what space is for what thing or use, or even worse, what space is for what kind of people. And this is, I think, let's say the field of rights where we are working. So before starting to think how to manage space, we should go back slightly for a moment to the very nature of space, which is total freedom.
Total freedom sounds good. I mean, when I first saw that photograph, I thought it was maybe something like Milan in 2080, you know, with climate change, and I thought they were going to go in that direction. So it's interesting that you're going in the freedom, and it's true, the resilience that people have to create also a public space, even in relatively inhuman sometimes conditions, let's say. So thanks for that reminder. I'd like to kick off this discussion with you with a relatively open question, because I'm just wondering, even, why are we discussing today the public realm? I mean, the fact that we're bringing this topic up, to me, would signal that for a while maybe we haven't been thinking about the public realm, haven't been taking care of the public realm. Would you share that assessment that cities have been maybe thinking about other types of infrastructure, other types of objectives in mind other than the public realm, and that's why we need to discuss this today? And what do you think are the drivers that might be pushing local policymakers, urban planners, urban mobility operators to consider the public realm more? Maybe Luca, a first comment on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that the first thing to say and crucial is that the public realm is if not the primary space where we interact with each other. As humans, it's a place of encounter. It can be a place of conflict, of course. At the very least, a place of awareness of each other. So that's really a very, very basic function. Secondly, just as basic, this is also the place, the physical space where we interact with the physical environment, be it built or natural. So the two together, you could say that the public realm is the place where we are fully alive, fully human. And I think that the pandemic, which like now has increased our reliance on digital space, has conversely stressed how much we also need physical space for both, interacting with each other and interacting with the environment. So, and why now this is so high on the agenda, because this is so basic, so essential. The public realm should enable these interactions, but it often does not. We see, for instance, that when one function like motorized traffic is dominating, all other functions, all other interactions are wiped out. So there is need to re-establish these possibilities.
And Rossella, from your perspective in the city of Milan, do you see that there's a drive to rethink, a need to rethink, an urge to rethink the city and the public realm, for instance, within Milan? Is that a pressure that you feel?
Yeah, definitely. A very positive pressure indeed. I'm very happy that the city, let's say, has had a sort of a awakening in the latest years, as Milan was not historically a city with a strong culture of public space, and now it's developing a very powerful view on how to regain all that space which is redundantly abundant for car use, and give it back to the city in a very different way, with higher value of any kind, higher environmental and simply higher quality, which is, I think, it's a very powerful way to rethink to urban resilience as a whole. So again, I always stress a lot this aspect of public rights, and I'm also very happy that Rawad showed that kind of infographic, which has a lot to do with the distribution of right, actually, in the city of Milan, which is very coherent with what I'm saying, even if we spoke a very visual, different language while trying to show so. But it's very interesting. So actually, in the fact that that space allows possibilities, there's no possibility for anything to happen if space does not exist. Even under a pretty much physical point of view, space equals possibility. So public space is the materialization of public rights, and public realm is the field of these rights. So when we work on public space, we are actually defending basic rights of citizens. And so there's much more than merely technical work of the mobility departments and mobility technicians and designers when we speak about this kind of issues. It's much more about access to services, to information, for example, to quality of life, to an equal treatment of any sort, to happiness in general. And as Luca was saying, COVID taught us a lot of things, so much about this while, let's say, contracting our field of rights in a very short and dense historical moment. We learned so much from this.
Okay, so you would say that it's driven mostly by a concern for human rights and quality of life in the city. Rawad, some of these tools that you have, so are cities coming to you to try and get access to certain tools to help them visualize, understand the public realm? Do you see a greater interest in this today?
Yeah, absolutely, Jean-Paul. I think it's well, this is for sure happening, but before getting to get to that, I just wanted to build up a bit on what my colleagues were saying. I think the whole thing starts from further awareness of the way we've been living. It's not sustainable. There's something we have to change. I think when we talk about public realm, the main thing is to start rethinking the space we walk in, the space we use, just imagining also how to combat something that have been filling our streets, which are cars. And I think that the biggest topic here are cars, like Luca showed. I think this is a wonderful example. But I think it all starts from awareness. The new generation today, we have been studying trends by looking at data, and we have been noticing There is a new preference today. People, also new generations, they want freedom. They want alternative choices. They don't want to have one alternative. They want to think of the street as something that you can appropriate for your own use based on your own preferences. And I think it all starts from a different mindset that we're living today. I think in the very near future, competitiveness is going to change. Perhaps if we talk about 20 years ago, perhaps competitiveness between cities was based on different KPIs. Today we have different sets of indicators. The indicators today are looking much more into quality. They're looking into the alternatives that I can give every user. We have to look at the specificities of the different users. So that's why, when going back to your question, we're being asked today, what is the future of the cities? What is the future of mobility? And what we do, we start looking at the here and now. We start looking at understanding how people are behaving today and what is the constituency of the city. We look at numbers. We try to boil things into sets of parameters. And that's our role. And then we visualize this. But because once you visualize things, you start noticing inequalities, you start noticing excess, you start noticing that you have to put the accents on some topic rather than another. You start looking at the ecosystem and looking at how to make it work for the best. And the public realm is the solvent here. It's the catalyst. It's the place where we express ourselves, where we interact, and this is becoming more and more important. I think also it's also related to the way we live the world. We are all aware of each other. We know that something happens in South India just almost in a split second, and I think it somehow projects on the local scale. We're starting just to start being aware of how much the local is fundamental. I think the pandemic showed us in a huge example of how much the local is important. So it's not about where I live in a city, it's about where I live exactly within a radius of 1.5 kilometers. So things are changing, and so is public realm.
Okay, so it's even more at the level of a neighborhood or a locality than necessarily at the level of a mega city, let's say, that we're talking about, and that maybe also comes back to this image of Michael, the square. Have you also witnessed then in Catalonia, maybe mostly, this push to try and rethink the public realm? Is this something important that you see today that was maybe less so in the past?
Yeah, I think Barcelona has really capitalized on the challenges posed by coronavirus and the reduction of traffic to take more ownership over the public realm and open more space to pedestrians and other uses. We've been engaging very directly through my university with the opening of terraces for restaurants. The city permitted something like 2,600 new terraces for restaurants that occupied what was previously vehicular space. I know Milan has done a lot of reclamation of space also. But to maybe scale out a little bit, I think what my colleagues have introduced is very interesting. And to put things in perspective, it's all too easy to criticize the recent history of urbanism and to say that maybe designers were not focused on the import of the public realm up until now. But if we're being completely honest, it's just because there were different problems to solve. The priority was different. We had to deal with basic issues like sanitation and like ventilation and lighting. I think on the whole, having this very rational approach to our cities as kind of machines for living, like the Corbusier model, it has made major improvements since the days of the Industrial Revolution and tenement housing in our cities. But now that we've made some of those achievements, we can think back about maybe what we lost by having that rational perspective. And I think that gets to really what both Luca and Rossella were hinting on, the idea of spontaneity and especially spontaneous interaction. Our mechanization and digitalization has allowed us to connect with people across the world, and it's given us this incredible ability to never be bored, to always focus our attention on something we want to pay attention to with our portable screens. But what we lose maybe is that connection to our immediate surrounding, and especially those surprise interactions that really live in the public realm. That's why these spaces, they need to be flexibly designed, because it shouldn't be that I know I'm going to meet my next door neighbor. It should be that I might see somebody from a completely different walk of life in this public space and have a new insight that I wouldn't have expected. So that kind of spontaneity is really what lives in the public realm and that we're lacking with our programmed interactions.
Yeah, I understand, and at the same time, it requires so much of a shift. And I suppose that also the other question is then who's actually in charge of creating that transformation? Because from all the images and all the elements that you raise, there's always a bit of a concept that the public realm has to eat back space onto what is something else. Maybe it's motorized traffic, private vehicles. So there's necessarily going to be a tension there. So what is that interplay? How do you see that rolling out in cities without creating a lot of tension? Maybe Luca and Rosella first.
Yes, let's say first that we do need to engage a diversity of actors. I mean, if diversity is key, if interaction is key, we need public actors, we need private actors, we need civil society, which is different than the public, than government. So that's the first step. But then the second step, and that it's very crucial. We can have that ideal, but we cannot have do everything everywhere for everybody. That's not real. So that we have to make choices. And I think the point there is that there has to be a deliberation about these choices, which is transparent, which is democratic, which is inclusive. And that's where I think the public actor, I mean, Rosella was talking about public rights, has a role, not so much in deciding, imposing something, but in allowing an open debate and experimentation about how to use the public realm and ensuring that what is decided, what we together agree is preserved and protected. Hence, so that's how I would start this discussion.
Okay, Rosella, please.
Sure. Yeah, I totally agree with both Luca and Michael. They said very crucial things, which I will not say again. What I can add to this is that there is all a spectrum of actors and, let's say, management styles of urban spaces, so that we can have private spaces that can behave as fully public, or even publicly owned space that are privatized by fact. And everything in between these two extreme cases exists and should probably be let existed, meaning that you can't know to what consequences, even positive or negative, each kind of each shade of space under the ownership, under the physical condition might lead to. So coexistence of difference model is crucial to create unpredictability also in the condition that create the diversity in neighborhoods. Actually, some risks behind the slogan of 15-minute city is that somehow you could risk to allow self-sufficiency of neighborhoods under some point of view, which could lead to some sort of an atomization of them and imply the loss of discovery, of serendipity, because if you're not pushed in some way to explore something that is slightly, let's say, behind the wall of 15-minute reachability, you could lose some piece of the urban experience, of course. So this is not the meaning of 15-minute cities. It's not something quantitative. It's much more about something qualitative, meaning that you might choose to access something crucial for your life within the 15 minutes walking, hopefully, time space, let's say, dimension. But you can also choose to go much more far after that, and choose a different urban experience within the same liberty condition. That's exactly, I think, what's my opinion of this 15-minute city concept.
Yeah, I mean, because in a way you could also just go and live in a village, and then it's necessarily a sort of a 15-minute life. It's not about being lazy, as I understand it. It's more about the quality of service that you get close by. But Rawad, you were mentioning cars, right? Very clearly. is the concept of public realm necessarily linked then to, I mean, I'll put it bluntly, but cars disappearing and other forms of mobility appearing or being much more present? Typically walking, cycling, but also maybe just standing and sitting. Is this a necessary step, or can the public realm, according to you, coexist with cars and motorized traffic?
Yeah, well, I think there's a transition that should be lived. No, we can't imagine just all of a sudden to do a transformation. I think the way that public administration, very interesting cities today, are doing their job, they're doing it very well, because they're just providing the conditions and the platforms for private to intervene, to interpret people's needs, because the market is very much responsive. And I think the public authority is always the good one, is that is just listening to what's happening. So I think it's in a sense this yeah, I mean, first thing is absolutely, if we want a new public realm, we have to think of a public realm with much less cars. This is for sure, 100%. But apart from this, I think what's happening to cars and to mobility, and what happened in the past few years, it manifests how much public and private relationship became very much complicated, very much complex. It's not something that we used to have or to see in 15 or 20 years from today. The relationship became much more complex, and I think the manifestation of this is if you just start looking at the offering we have today. At some point in the past, the whatever was public was something that you can never use privately, and this was questioned today. We're moving from ownership into usership. We're moving into ridership. We're starting to create some spheres that are much more complicated than the simple dichotomy of a public or private. We can take the example of any sharing device. It can be a car sharing, a bike sharing, it can be scooter sharing. And I think this is a very good example of how much of where the private came in and provided an offering which gave an alternative. It gave a benefit. It also, just to give you one example, micro scooters, for instance, the kick scooters we have today. We have lots of studies that are showing that those kick scooters are completing the last mile from your final destination to a metro stop. And I think this is a perfect example of synergy between these two modes. And we did our exercise, and we got all the data from different APIs, from different manufacturers, and we observed that whoever was saying that one is taking one chunk of another was not really correct, because they are still living in synergy. And I think that the big question today, when we think about public transportation, whoever is going to save or to, let's say, to protect public transportation is going to be the private, whether it's in terms of awareness, whether it's in terms of simply trying to not to give an offering that replaces public transportation but completes it. And I think this is one of the big topics we have to discuss exactly today in a post-pandemic era, where we have to protect all the investments that we have done in the past decades. Otherwise, everything we've done is going just to be now just denied or cancelled by new offering. And I think this is not really sustainable. So I think your question is about who's in charge. I think both. And I think now the synergy between both is increasing as we speak, and will take us to a point where the public and private will be almost just working in perfect unison.
Well, I hope that's possible. You know, I mean, I understand that it's the public realm is not necessarily a space for public transport operators. I mean, any kind of operator can have a good and positive offering for the public realm, But Michael, can you also then comment maybe on this combination between the micromobility, walking, cycling, pedestrians versus cars, and maybe in some of the examples that you've worked on locally, how you've seen that transformation?
Sure. First, I'd just like to acknowledge that there's always going to be tension in these transformations. It's never about eliminating the tension altogether. It's going to be about finding the optimal balance, right? And that's where we are with cars now. Historically, we have prioritized motor vehicle traffic, and to the extent that it has come at a severe expense to all these other micromobility options. So there's a rebalancing that needs to happen. And that can be definitely leveraged by new technologies. These kind of sharing platforms that are enabled by digital technologies that Rowan was discussing are incredibly interesting for their potential for synergy between public and private, but also because they offer this new model of sharing that maybe was not feasible before digital technologies. But now that we have these platforms to access assets, to know when they're available, to know where they're located, we can start to really think about new applications. So clearly, cars have proven successful, bikes have proven successful, scooters are proving successful, but we could also start to think about perhaps furniture for the public realm that's more flexible, that reinforces these ideas of spontaneity by being mobile, rentable, as opposed to the usual very rigid and fixed elements that define the public realm. And then when we think about also these different mobilities coexisting, there are, of course, logical concerns about safety, about collision and accidents. But again, we need to just put this in context of rebalancing. Scooters do have accidents, bicycles can have accidents, but cars are far and away more dangerous. They kill far more many people. And really the majority of these collisions that happen with the other micromobility vehicles occur with cars or because of conflicts with cars. So we can achieve a lot more flexibility, a lot more integration by reducing the number of cars at large.
And you bring in this issue around knowledge, and in a way, what I understand is that data, digital tools almost create space in themselves because they allow planners, policymakers to better understand the space, maybe optimize the space around them. Maybe Rossella first, how are you working then with digital tools to help you think about the kind of decisions you need to make in Milan to favor certain types of mobility over, for instance, cars, but I don't think it's the only one. How are you using these tools on a daily basis?
Well, there are a bunch of big to small projects and activities that the city of Milan has under this point of view. This has to do with the monitoring of the actual use of spaces. So we're using basically counters to understand the effects of transformation when we pedestrianize spaces, and particularly when we install new bike lanes, has it been happening in 2020, with this huge, let's say, push to emergency, let's say, or very quickly made pop-up bike lanes that we created to fill in the gap of a city that has a strong ambition towards, let's say, building from scratch a sustainable mobility as a whole, but that still is heavily under-equipped under the point of view of bike lanes and so on. So we gave a high push on this in 2020, and then now we need to monitorize the efficiency of these new paths and to correct them if it's needed. This is I think a very powerful way to use monitoring and sensors to optimize the effect of what to do to transform spaces into something that has to do that have to do with the active mobility specifically. But I also think that more software application like the ones we are mentioning, that we've been mentioning, can be exactly useful to understand the diversity of paths that citizens choose, not to have a simply banal A to B, let's say, linear connection when they choose a path to pursue an everyday goal. We're studying how different paths can be chosen in order to achieve a higher quality of the urban experience. So, for example, and I would like to connect with something that Andreas said in first place, when he said that basically you don't necessarily want to go from A to B in the short time possible, but probably you want to not feel that you're wasting your time while doing this. So understanding these dynamics is of course, something that is now much more possible through digital technologies, monitoring and GPS and something. But I'm also interested in how digital technologies, let's say, localized in public spaces, can provide an actual extension of rights of access to something for citizens. For example, the electric charge will be something spreading very, very quickly in the next few years. So it's something that we can will have to observe carefully, because it can be a very positive transformation, but also a risky one. But also, for example, under the point of view of access of information, for example, access to Wi-Fi publicly free in public spaces is something that really can change, can alterate the use of that space under the merely, let's say, human occupation of that space. We've been observing people gathering all of a sudden around Wi-Fi spots, and let's say, the effect of these digital technologies came before the ability of the city to design those spaces accordingly. So these observations are very crucial in these years.
Yeah, because it's not just a question of replacing the current city that we have with by I don't know, pedestrianizing without actually changing the look and feel. I mean, it's true that if you're walking somewhere, you might take a route that's pleasant rather than short, whereas in a car, you're probably mostly interested in time. I mean, that's possible. But Rawad, I mean, I think these digital tools, this working with data is one of your key areas of activity. What kind of data sets are cities looking for here to help them think about these urban mobility solutions for their cities and improving the public realm? And how do you see that facilitating the process?
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I can talk about this from planning point of view. So this is exactly going to respond to your question. Just generally, I think, just to give an example, we used to do our mobility plans just by doing some surveys, and those surveys can typically cover roughly 2, 3, 4%, 5% if you're lucky, of a sample size of the people using the city. So basically you're planning on a 5% basis. I think the data we have today that we can get from people moving, whether it's a handheld device, cell phone, location-based services, or the GPS in your car, is pushing the limit and giving us the chance to start looking at the bigger chunk of people, but not just of where they move. And we have some associations to the length of their trip. We can understand. We have associations to understand the age of those moving. So what we call today is the big data. And what we think is most important, what's most influencing the process today, is not just the amount of data, but the fact that compared to the traditional process of designing, implementing, looking at results, this used to take years. And today, this whole thing is being compressed, because as we get the data faster, we can plan faster, we can start implementing. And once we implement, we start getting the first feedback, and then we start correcting. So in terms of process, this is moving the design process from a linear one into much more of a cyclical process. Or we can put it this way, it's moving from being selective to being iterative. And this is absolutely changing the way we design. We worked on a couple of examples with cities in the US, for instance, on living labs, where in 3 months we're capable on having all the results needed to start understanding where to prioritize action. And this is based on numbers and based on, so just to give you an example, we can map today where are the movements from 0 to 2 kilometers taking place in the city. And we know, and mind you, these are vehicle movements. And then we know where are the places where we have the highest probability of shifting modes. So we are defining those areas where we need to intervene. So the digital world is becoming a responsive world where we learn more about how people are using space, and consequently we can design for this. And this is something we're doing right now on designing future devices, whether it's on micromobility, where we're setting programs on walkability. We've done lots of work during the pandemic also in the city of Milan to understand the assets we have, the sidewalk sizes we have, and where the elderly is living, and where should we start improving and building. So this digital world is becoming a huge asset and is giving us all types of benefits that is going to increase more and more. And here I'm just talking about the planning process. Anyone in operations will tell you more and more stories about this, but I will stop here.
Thanks. It's I mean, as a comment, you know, it's almost ironic in a way that we need all these tools to create spontaneity. You know, it's almost ironic. But maybe Luca also has a comment then on the planning front, the use of data. How are you working with these tools?
Well, let's see. I mean, it's fantastic, all these possibilities have been evocated, but let me see whether I can put it also a critical notion there, because I think that the starting point should be this very rich notion of the public realm that all of us are bringing in today. So it's not just mobility, it's also all sort of other uses. It's not only things like travel time, it's also a travel experience in all their richness. So first, this to me has a very clear implication. It means that the data has to be able to represent this richness. And of course, numbers, traces can do part of it, but not only. It's also things as stories, and stories that we tell to each other may be live. You know, so I think first we need a richer notion of what data is, and that's a risk of blindly following the smart city paradigm. And the second issue is related to this idea that, you know, we have to make difficult choices. We have to have a political debate about this. And this points to another issue, which is the ownership of data, which is distinct from the just as relevant issue of privacy. We give all this data as user, we should be able also to do something with it, to use it, to understand better what are the choices, to understand better how we can choose. It should empower those giving the data. So I think this is also an issue which is important, and a risk in certain approaches to the smart city, which do not empower the users, but more a few controllers of the data.
And you bring up, I think, a point which must be part of the public realm, which is indeed the participation of citizens in the design and the shaping of the urban planning and other decisions. Michael, maybe a comment on that, on the use of digital tools, but also how are you able in practice, because we understand the theory is great, getting citizens involved, fantastic, we all agree, but in practice, how can you make that possible, and how can you make these digital tools serve citizens' interests?
Yeah, that was a great introduction to the idea of participation, Lucas. Thank you for that, because it is absolutely key. And there's, with every technology or with every change, you know, a potential risk and a potential benefit. So when we talk about sensing and using big data to make decisions and to inform policymakers and designers, of course, there's much more information that we can work with there that enables this iteration that Rawad highlighted. But there's a risk. One of the benefits of the survey approach, even if it's a smaller sample size, is at least you were engaging people to respond to the survey. With data, there's always a risk of not asking people because we have the data. But of course, it doesn't have to go that way. We're huge advocates at EAC of citizen science, of creating technologies that are accessible by the uneducated or not particularly skilled public, or more people who can learn skills quickly. So these can be sensors for monitoring anything like air quality to the number of pedestrians in an area, that citizens can then choose where to deploy and connect to a larger network to create this big data, but in a participatory way. So that engenders these feelings of ownership, of engagement in the process. But we need to be careful not to stop there, not to stop at the point of data and knowing what the goal is. We have this, you know, vision that I think the four of us share of this very, very dynamic urban space that is optimized for pedestrians and other modes of traffic. But it has to be locally adapted. It has to be locally specific based on the feedback from citizens in that place. We can have this end vision, but we also need the feedback about how to get there, about what steps need to happen in which order to achieve that vision. Just for an extreme example, if we're in a neighborhood that doesn't meet the 15-minute city criteria, that has no amenities within 15 minutes, and we pedestrianize thoroughfares, then people can't get to what they need in an effective way, and we've created a harm to the public area. So we can rely on citizens through digital platforms, through digital technologies, to tell us what they would need for pedestrianism or multimodality to be workable for them, to be able to get to what they need within these smaller radii.
But I sometimes wonder, I mean, we sort of think that citizens would say, yeah, we need more pedestrian areas, but it's also the same citizens that will want to drive their car and be comfortable. And, it's not necessarily going to fit with your vision, I would say. How do you deal with that? And maybe it's not your role to deal with that. It's the policymaker's role in the end, probably. But maybe Rawad, or maybe also a comment on that, and to respond to Luca's point, I think it would be useful to hear from you.
Yeah, absolutely. Perhaps it's my personal passion to big data that pushes me to be misunderstood a bit. No, just kidding. Thanks, Michael, for pointing out that. Actually, we're having two projects right now. One is on gender issues in transportation, and we're looking at the data, but at the same time, we're having lots of focus groups and trying to talk to people and collect data. So it's always the best way not to trust your data, or just not to put some doubt on data, and to go back and validate that. So we're doing another example in the city of Bologna, on the 15-minute city, and it's based on specific users, which are kids or children from 11 to 14, which are the first users going to school. And what we're doing, that we're trying to make sure that, or not make sure, but just we're trying to validate our data, or give it much more of a perceptive perspective, which is today lacking, because the data is very synoptic. In a sense, it gives you an idea of everything in a very spread way. But once you go back and you have your questionnaires, and you go and you talk to people and get there, you notice that the way we perceive space and we perceive public space is very often contradicting data. The sense of safety is very subjective, like the sense of safety for a father or a mother with pushing a 1-year-old baby, or an 11-year or 12-year is totally different. And we're doing lots of experiments. So I don't think we never get out with a plan without getting back on the ground and getting back to people and to users, and learning much more than what we learn from data. So in terms of engagement, I think this is more and more something we're seeing today. And the digital world, the platform today, is helping us, because we get opinion from applications, we get opinions online, and so on. So this really is these two worlds are going to feed into each other and help for a better outcome.
You raise an important point, and in a previous mobility talks where we discussed citizen engagement, it was one of the key aspects that came out, that make it focused on user groups. Make it adapted to user groups, because they are the ones who have to deal with very specific situations. Rosella, maybe then also a comment on that in relation to experiments in cities, satisfying the needs even of the citizens who are actually going against, in practice, the kind of vision that you would like maybe to implement in Milan. How do you deal with that? Because ultimately, your bosses need to get re-elected, right?
Definitely. Yeah, it's a hard work, but someone has to do it. So yes, it's let's say the dimension of conflict is always there, and it's natural. So you have to basically accept that it exists, and work together in groups. To smoothen a little bit that conflict, and not making it naturally disappear, because it exists, it's natural. So what we are doing in the latest years is trying to involve citizens in every phases of the transformation, from the selection of spaces to the proposition of the transformation, to the co-design activity of that transformation, and to the co-realization of the transformation to some extent, of course. With this huge process that as you can understand, has several steps, but also is very wide in terms of number of people involved, you can in a way get to some sort of let's say coexistence of opposite views in to the maximum extent possible. Then you have, of course, to direct some choices under a political point of view, because that's the role of politics. I mean, politics has a very honest role in a way in society, which is to understand whether some choices belong to a coherent vision or not, or you are scattering pieces of what you do that do not match together, do not create a coherent picture. So you have all aspects of this, and what we are doing under basically the Piazze Aperte program is this very inclusive process of co-creation of spaces. And the most important and interesting aspect of this is that you get very interesting and surprising answers from the citizens in terms of quantity, but also in terms of quality of definition of desires, of needs. That's the kind of information that you will never gather through basic data. That kind of information is super precious for urban government, because you can really reach a high quality offering when you are able to work with this kind of issues and needs.
Okay, I see, and at the same time in the audience, I see a question here that might go a little bit against that, also maybe a little bit against Luca. So I might raise it with him. You know, they're basically saying asking citizens may already, in fact, constrain or create a strong bias in an outcome. And so you were mentioning these stories. Maybe you will tend to go to the stories that you want to hear, as opposed to the stories that you don't want to hear. Yep. And maybe then the data, going through the data angle, is maybe less invasive in that sense. Maybe creates a more neutral understanding of the situation. Maybe a comment on that, Luca.
Well, let me say to think one in a way Rossella already answered when she was saying that the kind of information she gathers from trying out things, having discussion with inhabitants about their experience, are of a nature that data, passive data cannot give. So it's about engaging and being open to also to stories. I'm not saying, you should impose a story. I'm just saying that some kind of information you will only get by engaging with people, and by engaging also face to face in qualitative ways. So second, I think the notion of experiments there is very crucial. Again, there are different, interest, demands. Sometimes the transformation it's requires a big change, and resistance is totally legitimate, I think. But why are experiments so interesting? One, they are temporary and reversible, so they're kind of offer a safe space to prefigure what could be. But second, and again, in a way, in terms of information, they are an experience. You could never get the same information that you get from an actual experiment, from a simulation, from a debate, a discussion, just the word. So trying and do things in spaces. These are okay examples that Rossella is using. I think it's a very, very powerful instrument, even necessary, not just to involve citizens, but to learn from them. That's crucial. Learn from the involvement. I mean, involvement is not a way of convincing, it's a way of learning, of being open to ideas and understanding that we might not have before having engaged, having experimented.
Yeah, the engagement with citizens is not just about the knowledge that it can bring. It does bring knowledge, but it's also about engaging them in the process and securing their support for a possible outcome. I understand that, and I imagine experiment, Michael, that must be really your playground, right? So can you maybe give us a recipe for success to turn an experiment into a more permanent feature of a city?
Well, the most important thing, I think, has already been touched on by my colleagues here, and that's having participation in every step in conceiving what the experiment should try to achieve and how it will be conducted, in realizing it, and then in evaluating the success in order to get buy-in, in order to get this sense of ownership. so that it becomes really a public asset and something that the public desires. But I want to be clear that participation is not limited only to citizens in this case. We need to involve all stakeholders in as many steps of the process as possible. So it's not just a bilateral dialogue between citizens and designers, but the municipalities that are responsible for maintaining, likely funding these implementations need to be involved. Utility companies, all the different stakeholders need to be integrated as much as possible to make sure that this experiment can be sustainable in the long term and that we can learn all the different potential risks and identify solutions.
And there's a question in the audience. I'll try and raise this quickly. Is there a best moment to engage citizens? I know you mentioned the different stakeholders. Would you say there is a moment, a key moment in a process where citizens should be engaged? You know, early, middle, close to the end? What would you say?
I would say that's kind of a trick question. If you have to pick the beginning, because it sets everything that falls afterwards, but really you shouldn't have to pick. They should be engaged as often as possible. That's the best time.
Okay, we have another four minutes, I would say. So I would like to wrap up, sadly, because I think we could really go on with this discussion. I mean, it touches so many angles and elements, and we've probably only scratched the surface. What I would like you to reflect on is the public realm in 2050. Right, 2050 seems to be a relatively long term, but there are quite a few targets, political targets for 2050. It would be interesting to hear from you. What would be your top 3 concepts for the public realm in 2050? What would it look like in 2050? Can you think of 3 elements, concepts that you think would be characterizing the public realm in the future? Can you think about that? I'll give you 10 seconds, and then I'll start picking. So try and be brief and sharp. So can I go to Rawad first? I know that's a tricky one. The others have a bit more time to think, but Rawad, over to you.
You gave me just 8. You said 10. No, well, that's an interesting one. I haven't thought of it, but I would say it would be a greener public space. I feel this is happening everywhere. We're working in different countries in the world. And greenery is on top of many agendas. The second one is more walkability, more personal devices, less cars. And I think the third one would be a much more, as a result of the two, and the result of awareness, also a step-free type of environment where you start having less of those what we used to see in the 60s and 70s, +3, +2, -1, -2. We're going to have a blend that just is going to be somewhere where you can use your skateboard and just move everywhere. I think this would be a really nice thing also for disabled. So that's how I see it.
Thank you so much, Rawad. You were a great panelist. Thank you for taking the time and for telling us that skateboards will exist in 2050. Maybe then, Michael, are you ready?
Sure, I have to be. I would definitely emphasize multimodality, but I won't say much about that because we've talked a lot about that in this conversation. But clearly, the ability to have many modes of transport, deprioritizing cars is critical. Spontaneity. The flexibility of space to have different uses at different times of day, different times of year, which is facilitated partly by not having steps in the surfaces, but also all kinds of other infrastructural circumstances so that it's a flexible space. The last thing I would emphasize is renaturalization. So Rawad said greener public spaces, which is absolutely critical to achieve these climate change goals that we're faced with. But I think specifically we need to create space for nature and not artificialize nature in public space. Not simple monocultural plantings that are just aesthetic, but creating nature in public spaces that offers ecosystem services, that helps us with our water filtration and retention, helps us increase biodiversity, really improves air quality, integrating nature in a very naturalistic way in the public space.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. Almost like the jungle in the city, but not a city jungle. Thank you so much for having taken the time from the US to join us today, Michael. You were a great panelist as well, giving us great insights. Thank you, Rosella. Over to you.
Yeah, my position is pretty much the same as following the previous one. Specifically, the one from Michael is very close to mine. I can just add to that that public space could have a very intersectional role in the next urban challenges, trying to fill in the gap between all inequality and specifically climate, health, and also gender inequalities. That is very crucial in public space, as we still have huge inequality under that point of view that are still not completely discussed, and that has also a lot to do with the mobility, as Rawada was also mentioning in their research. So we have these very three things to solve, and we have time until 2050 to do this, and that will be great.
And you confirm that you're indeed working on this. So good luck, Rossella. Thank you very much for having taken the time to be with us from Milan. And we move over to Luca. And by the way, I'm also asking, what is your key takeaway to the audience from today's debate? So they're also busy writing their key takeaway. Luca, 2050, public realm.
Yeah, difficult to add something to this incredible list, but let's try. So first, and maybe most important, I would say a sense of openness and possibility, just that feeling. Second, people, but crucially different people that are different from each other, are not all the same. And third, maybe the feeling of air on our skin. So really public realm as a physical bodily experience.
Which you probably then would get by walking and cycling and to feel the air on your body rather than stuck in a metal box.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Luca, for sending us these good vibes from Amsterdam, for taking the time. Thanks to all of you. It was a really interesting debate. I mean, it's you're working with a very broad concept. I think for me the key takeaway would be that we need to really think on a human level and less on a functional level. And maybe this whole digital world that we're in will just push us quicker, hopefully, into a moment where we can actually meet, greet, touch and hug each other. So thanks a lot for having taken the time. And I will now hand over for the conclusions to Judith O'Mara. She's Director at Innovation Hub Central at the EIT Urban Mobility. So Judith, the difficult task is on you to conclude. And you may just want to click the unmute button.
Right, thank you very much. Thank you for handing over. Well, concluding is basically impossible. This is such a wide topic, and I think we've just started with the various aspects that needs to be addressed when you talk about the public realm. I thoroughly enjoyed the discussion. I'm a sociologist myself by training, so this was a lot of food for thought. My main pleasure is, first of all, to thank you all here for participating in this. Andreas for giving his keynote, bringing in quite a few very key issues like the challenge to bring in the interest of different opinions on board as you addressed this. He also, various times throughout the discussions, he also, of course, brought a few examples from which we can learn. The perception of travel time is, of course, very interesting. I experienced this a lot myself when I'm around, especially cities which I don't know. And while being at work, going from for a business trip, going from A to B, I usually don't choose the quickest way, but where to find the nicest route is something I very much would like to have addressed. Luca Berlusconi from City of Amsterdam, from the University of Amsterdam, actually representing Innovation Hub West, although I think we seem to have a very Italian dominated group. This is not really true. Luca, I know you are being cherished very much by your students, but also very much by the other your peer professors in the field. And throughout the discussion, I think we've learned why this is so. Thank you very much for participating. Robert, you brought in, of course, the perspective also from the private sector, but also right at the beginning you addressed the issue of social justice, and of course you addressed the use of and the advantages of the use of big data. So thank you for bringing these aspects to the discussion. Rosella, the woman, thank you for first of all, for being in this discussion and also for being so active in EIT, Urban Mobility, and especially Innovation Hub Central. We will work on the gender balance in future, I promise. Not always that easy. And Michael, the main takeaway I have personally had from you is how we can use technology and innovation really to apply them also to ecological principles. Of course, you said a lot more, but this is the key message I had. So thank you all very much for contributing to this. Of course, I could now start summing up, but we don't have much time. So I will now use the rest of the non-minute I have to talk about the future opportunities we will have in EIT urban mobility in the field of public spaces. So we have prepared a few slides. So we will have actually a call by EIT urban mobility within a cross-kick initiative, which is led by Climate Kick. And the idea of this call is basically to capitalize on solutions that are developed within EIT urban mobility projects and to encourage other cities to use them to drive their own urban transformation. There will be an information event on 11th of June, so if you're interested, please join. There's a second great opportunity, which we are a new opportunity within our newly created action and impact groups that we are planning to set up soon. There will be, most probably in autumn this year, the focus on the area of public realm, and we will focus on the new European Bauhaus initiative by the European Commission. So these new action and impact groups are one of our new pilot programs, and they aim at supporting our partners in EIT urban mobility and also other researchers and innovators to identify, apply for regional, national, and European funding. So there will be an information event and a kickoff meeting on 9th of June. I think you should find the link in the chat. So these are the programs where we will take this forward. But I think it should also be interesting to know that actually the EIT Urban Mobility Academy has developed online courses related to the field. So first of all, I would like to recommend a MOOC, a massive open online course, designing the cycling city, it is names, and it explores the best practices in biking infrastructure. So this is a 12-hour course, asynchronous, whatever that means, and this can be completed, and you have the chance to get a certificate. There is also a shorter course, 45 minutes, on the super blocks in Barcelona. We've seen a picture on them by Michael. This is a course with the participation of Salvador Rueda, who is one of the drivers of the super blocks. So please check out our websites from the Academy for these courses. Right, so this is the kind of activities we are currently having and which we will set up in the next month. And please also let me take this opportunity to thank, first of all, my colleague Juliana, who brought you all in here. and motivated you to participate. So thanks to Juliana, but also lots of thanks to the communication teams. Bernadette, Jezebel, working in the background. And of course, Jean-Paul, to you for being such a great moderator. So we're looking very much forward to our next mobility talks, which you will again moderate. So you can see the slide here. This is actually in July on intermodality. So please don't miss it. So thank you all again. Bye-bye. Have a lovely evening.